And our first speaker today is the lovely Dr. Sophie Matthiesson, and she is our senior curator here of international art at Toyo Tamaki. She is the coordinating curator of Light from Tate. Hopefully you've all been up there and seen it already. And also recent exhibitions that she has curated is one of them is Myths and Masculinities, which is up in the McKelvey Gallery currently, and the exhibition Heavenly Beings of Byzantine Icons. And prior to the gallery, she worked as a curator and educator in Australia and also the United Kingdom. Today, Sophie will speak to us about light in Northern European art from the 16th to the 20th century, including Vermeer and Hammershøi. So if you'd like to help me in welcoming Sophie.
Thank you very much, Paola and Heather, for organising this fantastic set of events around Tate. And thank you for coming. It's my great pleasure to talk on a subject about which I know relatively little, but I have found an angle into the discussion of Vermeer. As you probably know, there is no Vermeer on this side of the world, and the literature around him has been pretty unsatisfactory for a long time, and so I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about that in my paper today. But one of the one impetus for doing this talk was that Hedda is Dutch, and she asked me, and so I thought it was only respectful to say yes. And also we have the Vermeer exhibition at the Rijksmuseum, which closes on the 4th of June. And for anyone who's been curious in it, you'll know that those tickets had long sold out, so no matter who you are in the world, you cannot get to see it. So that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So I thought this is a good time to reflect on the impact of paintings by Vermeer that during the late 19th and early 20th century, where they were shown for the first time in England in particular, but also in France. Now, Vermeer was not always a superstar. He was prominent in his own day in Delft, in the small city of Delft, and his closest competitor, rival, was Peter de Hoogh, who also painted genre scenes of women in interiors, quiet scenes of domesticity in beautiful, clear light. But Vermeer was well known in his time. He was the head of the Painters Academy called the Guild of St. Luke, and he charged a handsome amount for his works, but he was a slow painter, and there are only 35 or so of his pictures known today, so they were snapped up in his own time, and he just went into an eclipse, and there were a few revivals. So in France, in fact, in the 18th century, before the French Revolution, there was a person called Lebrun, the husband of Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, the painter, who had a gallery of Dutch paintings, and he gave some prominence to Vermeer. But Vermeer, there's only ever been a small handful of works in existence, and he sort of fell back into eclipse. So what I'll talk about today is when he was really launched onto the international stage in the late 19th century. So this was thanks largely to the efforts of one collector and art critic in France, a man called Théophile Thoré-Berger. Here he is. And he's quite a well-known figure, but he did write a lot under pseudonyms because he was also a political radical, quite often on the run from the French government. A romantic revolutionary, a champion of maverick painters, and a foe of the art establishment or academy, Torre Bourget not only dedicated himself to raising awareness of his particular passion, which was 17th century Dutch painting, but he also advocated tirelessly in his own time for the realist painters of the Barbizon school, the nature landscape painters that Kenneth will be talking about next. And also for upcoming French artists such as the Impressionists, Claude Monet and Manet. So he was very much a man of his time, but also a man who was very courageous in going against the currents of the government and official salon art. So a prominent French critic and a political activist of the most radical socialist stripe, Torre Bourget first discovered the Delft painter's work in 1842 when he was visiting in the Netherlands, not long after his release from a stint in the political prison of Sainte-Pélagie in Paris. During that visit, he had chanced upon Vermeer's View of Delft, which you see here, of 1660, in the Maurits House in The Hague. Bowled over, he later described that painting as, quote, a superb and most unusual landscape, which captures the attention of every visitor and powerfully impresses artists and connoisseurs. It is the view of a town with a quay, an old gatehouse, buildings in a great variety of styles of architecture, garden walls, trees, and in the foreground a canal and a strip of land with several figures. The brilliance of the light, the intensity of the colour, the solidity of the paint in certain parts, the effect in total is both very real and nevertheless original. So it was both imitating nature incredibly carefully, but also inventive. 6 years later, and by this time, an official political exile from France and a marked man, Torre Bourget retraced his steps to Holland and embarked on a full-scale hunt for Vermeer paintings, unearthing further examples such as the milkmaid that you see here and the little street on the right in the collection of a Mr. Six van Hillegom, a private collector, but they're both now in the Rijksmuseum. And he widened his search as well to the private collections of Northern Europe. More than one scholar has noted that Torre Bourget discovered in Vermeer's art what he had long been looking for in politics, which is to say a truly human and social art that was grounded in the lives of real and ordinary people. The qualities of these three pictures alone convinced the art critic that Vermeer belonged in the first ranks of the painters Frans Hals and Rembrandt. Although of modest means himself, Torre Bourget went on to assemble a sizable collection of Dutch paintings, including 3 examples by Vermeer, which he called his somewhat unusual gallery of bric-a-brac. And he went on to research and publish a major study of Vermeer, published in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts in 1866. In the preface of this now famous study, he alluded to Vermeer's past obscurity and his wish to see the artist recognised finally by public institutions and to be represented in their collections. He wrote, as an extended quote, "A dozen years ago, Jan van der Meer of Delft was almost unknown in France. His name was missing from the biographies and histories of painting, and his works were missing from the museums and the private collections. Living only 3 years beyond the publication of this founding monograph on Vermeer, Torre Bourget bequeathed his collection to his mistress of 10 years, Apolline Lacroix, who was the wife of the eminent director of the Arsenal Library in Paris called Paul Lacroix. In 1892, some years after the artist's death, after Torre Bourget's death, Paul Lacroix decided, on behalf of his wife, to sell the collection, which had the effect then of catapulting Vermeer into public consciousness and into the great institutional collections of England, France, and elsewhere. Given the timing of Torre Bourget's 1869 book and the 1892 posthumous sale of Vermeer, artists who were interested in painting light but who were perhaps less interested in the current example of French Impressionism, now found themselves with a viable alternative path. The current exhibition upstairs illustrates this path quite well. For those of you who have already seen the show, you may recall walking through the introductory rooms of Light from Tate, which present what one might call a compressed history of the modern painting of light in Britain and France. The exhibition opens with English artists such as Turner and Constable from the first half of the 19th century, and it looks at how each painter separately forged his own way of describing the behaviour of light in nature. You may have observed an increasing freedom of brushwork, an abandonment of traditional procedures and subject matter, and an incorporation of new materials and motifs. Then, as you progressed down the enfilade of rooms, you might recall a moment when you metaphorically crossed the English Channel and jumped forward in time another 50 years and came face to face with examples of the serial pictures by Claude Monet of poplars, river bends, and lily ponds, all made out of doors, the term being en plein air. And this was, of course, the great Claude Monet, who in some respects is considered the father of modern landscape painting and light, but he was an artist who openly admired the English predecessors Turner and Constable. And then, in turning the corner into the 20th century, you would move into a kind of vestibule room filled with paintings by a group of more theoretically inclined artists, a diverse group, both British and French, who applied the latest scientific research about colour and light theory, using tiny units of pure colour to recreate scintillating effects of light in otherwise quite mundane settings. These experimental artists, known as the neo-impressionists or more familiarly as the pointillists, are best summed up in one work in the room by the artist Albert Dubois-Pillet, whose small picture of a shimmering lock on a modern canal from 1886 has been recently acquired by this gallery. So then, just as painting seemed to be nearing the point of complete dissolution with paintings like this, that are sort of a vibrating mass of broken up units of colour, we discover a small group of paintings off to one side in a little room by themselves by a Danish artist called Wilhelm Hammershøi and by an Englishman called William Rothenstein. These scenes are painted between 1899 and 1906, just at the cusp of the 20th century, all feature bare domestic interiors of a serene simplicity and a muted tonality that unmistakably recall Dutch Golden Age painting of Johannes Vermeer in both structure and sensibility. Wilhelm Hammershøi had first encountered Vermeer during a visit to Amsterdam in 1887. In 1890, he took the train from Copenhagen to Paris, where he most certainly saw the work of Monet and quite possibly that of Dubois-Pillet and Seurat. But when his mother expressed concern that he might be, quote, infected by the French, Hammershøi reassured her, writing that, quote, I have travelled to Paris in order to see a great deal and also to learn something, but I think I will learn more from the old art than from the new. While Hammershøi was unlikely to have been able to see Vermeer's on that occasion, it hardly mattered at all, because the die had already long been cast in terms of Hammershøi's choice of model. For the rest of his career, Hammershøi would go on to paint his responses to the Vermeer works that he had first seen in Amsterdam in 1887. His 1899 portrait of his wife Ida reading a letter, for example, forms a virtual mirror image to the painting of the same subject by Vermeer 2 centuries earlier. Modern research now tells us that Vermeer was a great master of subtraction. He removed excess figures and motifs from his paintings, and the ghostly traces can be seen in them, but we know that he was continually paring down his work in order to give focus to a simplified cast of objects and forms. However, in this particular case, I think you could say that Hammershøi has outdone Vermeer in his pared-down response. He goes beyond the Golden Age master in austerity by reducing the furniture in the room, by draining the colour to a monochrome palette of greys and whites, by eliminating the direct source of light from the side window and replacing it with a cool secondary light which enters through the room via a door to an internal room and which further removes his wife from the source of natural light in the outdoors and intensifies that air of recessive solitude that surrounds her. For the London-based William Rothenstein, on the other hand, the sale in Paris of Torre Bourget's extraordinary Vermeer collection that had been placed on the market by Paul Lacroix would have been little short of momentous. This sale, which was staged at the auction house, the Hôtel Drouot, on 5 December 1892, contained 3 extraordinary examples of Vermeer's modest output. So remember that Vermeer is thought to have only had 35 autograph paintings to his name. And these 3 pictures came into view outside Holland for the first time. From that sale, Vermeer's Woman Standing at a Virginal, or Spinet as it was called, and I think I've forgotten again to put it in here, but I'll come up to it in a minute, was purchased by the National Gallery in London for 50,000 francs through a dealer called Bourgeois. The purchase was reported in the national press, with the London Evening Standard hailing it the very day it was hung as a work of, quote, high intrinsic merit and exceeding rarity. And the Westminster Gazette called it a very precious picture and one of a half dozen, quote, most precious pictures in the gallery. So this is high praise from the English art press. And this is the painting here on the left, well known to most of you, I'm sure. In 1910, a second work from that Torre Bourget sale was flushed out, Lady Seated at a Virginal, the painting on the right, and it made its way to the National Gallery London as part of the bequest of the recently deceased and colossally wealthy Australian collector called George Salting. And this was an event that reverberated across the colonies and was widely reported here in New Zealand and in the Australian press, of course. So research now indicates that the paintings were not only painted in the same year, but they were painted from the same bolt of cloth, and they presumably featured the same sitter as well. And in the background, there are pictures that really were part of Vermeer's collection or his mother-in-law's collection, and they've been discussed at length in recent research. But these are examples, in some cases, of the Utrecht school of Caravaggiosti, those Dutch painters who had trained in Italy and had come back with very theatrical lighting and genre scenes, bawdy scenes, the sorts of things that then Vermeer would absorb and then translate into a cooler, more restrained sort of Dutch mode. Vermeer would cast a very long shadow for the artists Hammershøi and Rothenstein in the early years of the 20th century. In 1898, Hammershøi and his wife moved into a 17th century street in Strandgade, number 30, Copenhagen. This was one of the oldest streets in the Christianshavn district of Copenhagen. The building that he bought, an apartment in it, dates to the 1620s, and it may very well have been chosen by Hammershøi on account of its close similarities to the buildings painted by Vermeer of similar age, such as the Guild building of St. Luke in Delft. Now, that was the painting made famous in his 1657 picture entitled The Little Street. So that building there with the red clinker bricks, it was effectively the place that Vermeer had his professional base, because he was the president of that guild more than once. The exteriors of both of these buildings show the metal pins or wall anchors, known in Dutch as muurankers, that secure the wooden frame of the building to the brick exterior. So they're a very distinctive feature, and it took me ages to find the Dutch term for them. But clearly they are a quirk about particularly Dutch and Northern European streetscapes of the 17th century. Hammershøi's choice of residence bears out his comment that personally I am fond of old houses, of old furniture, of that quite special mood that these things possess. Hammershøi over time made 60 paintings of his and Ida's apartment at Strandgarde in the decade that they lived there. So, returning briefly to the paintings in the exhibition upstairs, we get to see how this processing of Vermeer's example plays out. In one of the scenes by Hammershøi, we glimpse a view into a sparsely furnished room where Ida is shown standing with her back to us, possibly holding a letter. This is interior of 1899. She faces a corner of a room occupied by a stove and 2 closed white doors. With no bright colours or movements to disturb the tranquility, the only animation comes from the silent fall of afternoon light, striking the back of her neck and the wall beyond. Opposite this picture is a second painting, painted 7 years later, also by Hammershøi, called Interior Sunlight of 1906. It shows the same room, but facing the source of illumination this time. Here there is no figure. There is a shaft of light that's seen entering from an external courtyard window through the transparent aged window panes, and its imprinted reflection on the floor below is the actual subject of the scene. Although there's a backstory to this particular picture. It did include a picture of, to the left, a portrait of Ida standing, but the first owner of the picture in London, a musician, who may have been a misogynist or may just have been a formalist, folded it over and made her disappear. So she's the lady who vanishes, and it's now, that side of the canvas is so degraded that there's no bringing it back, but the Tate have kept it on the back of the canvas. So it could be an aesthetic, it could be a crime against female subject matter, but perhaps it was done for formal reasons. I don't know. Finally, on a third wall, we see an interior by William Rothenstein called Mother and Child of 1903. This scene depicts Rothenstein's wife Alice and their child in their newly acquired Queen Anne house at 26 Church Row, Hampstead in North London. The scene is less austere, but it is still sparse, and it features a chair and a mantelpiece with a few ornaments against the white panelled walls, and on one of those panels there's a little picture. As with Hammershøi's scenes from the same period, we are again made conscious of the window as a threshold to the exterior and the domestic space within as a place of calm introspection, feminine virtue and secular sort of sanctity. So there's an almost holy air about these domestic genre scenes. Like Hammershøi, Rothenstein appears to have selected his Hampstead house on the basis of its appearance, its archaic grandeur, harking back to the late 17th century and to the reign of the pro-Dutch Protestant Queen Anne. She lived between 1665 and 1714, so a little later than Vermeer, and she ruled between 1702 and 1707. But she was very pro-Dutch. In the late 19th century, the Queen Anne architecture enjoyed quite a revival, and new buildings in this style, built from the 1870s onwards, were being touted as neo-Flemish, and they were the most fashionable suites of apartment blocks in Kensington and Chelsea, which were well-known artists, suburbs for affluent artists like Whistler. They utilised the hallmark Dutch red bricks and the high mullioned windows of traditional Dutch architecture. Rothenstein, however, went one better by finding himself in 1902 a genuine Queen Anne period house in the also bohemian and also gracious North London. And he wrote to his father that it was, quote, suitable both as a living house and as painting one. It would serve me nobly in the way of interiors as the rooms are most exquisite. Interestingly though, Rothenstein, who was said to be obsessed with interiors in this period and who had stripped down the interior decorations in accordance with his own aesthetic arts and crafts sensibility, began to find the element of opulence in the panelling of the rooms irksome and disturbing. His account of how he came to feel about his historic house, which he'd bought as a treasure, is quite revealing, for it is a clue that he would in fact have preferred something simpler and something earlier, in the style better suited for genre painting. He would, in short, have preferred something more Vermeer-like, an earlier building. He wrote, "I came to feel its very beauty to be a defect. It was all too perfect, too stylish, for I was aiming at something more elemental than a Queen Anne interior. I was painting wife and child and wished to suggest every wife and every child, and Queen Anne kept getting in the way." So he eventually did find another house for his family to move in. He really did believe in his artistic principles, and so he just picked himself up and moved on. But when Rothenstein exhibited this picture of his wife and child at the autumn exhibition of the New English Art Club in late 1903, no one pointed out the unwanted element of sophistication in the panelling. Acutely aware of the splendid Vermeer of a woman standing at a spinet, now hanging in pride of place at the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square, the critic of the Daily Telegraph and Courier in London could hardly have failed to notice Rothenstein's mirroring of the constructed space of the London picture. Rothenstein shows a woman in profile with her back to the window and crisp right angles at the room's corner where floors and walls meet. Nor would Rothenstein's witty replacement of Vermeer's upright, fair-haired model with his own infant son, all blue and white ruffles and blonde curls, elevated on his mother's lap, occupying her place. The reviewer singled out Rothenstein's pictures for particular appreciation at this show, writing that the painter, quote, is setting himself difficult problems of interior lighting, not without an eye to the successes of some contemporary French painters in the same line, but still more, and he might even have been referring to Hammershøi as well here, but still more with an eye to the successes of the wonderful colour and chiaroscuro exercises of Vermeer of Delft, based upon similar motifs. The critic paused to reflect on how Vermeer, even though light might be the hero, heroises a soft human glow and lifts his characters from the category of mere technical exercises into those of pictures in the higher sense. He then goes on to praise Rothenstein's picture for its, quote, happy treatment of light and the idea of the child looking over its mother's head to see out the window. So here the critic is making a point that genre painting, when done well and with humanity, joins the ranks of history painting and those more esteemed categories of pictures according to academic theory. So he's really putting painting of modern life into a much higher rank. It is difficult to imagine how such a well-connected artist as Rothenstein, who was not just a painter, but he was a printmaker, a draftsman, a lecturer, a writer on art, and a friend of all of the advanced artists of his day, both sides of the channel, never actually met Hammershøi to our knowledge. Both men used pared back, carefully selected homes that they'd bought especially to paint. They both had a shared admiration of Whistler and a passion for Dutch genre painting, and even shared the same London gallerist, a man called Van Visseling, at the Dutch Gallery in Brook Street. So it does seem extraordinary they didn't cross paths, but I think Hammershøi is quite a retiring man, unlike Rothenstein, who did get about and was everywhere at once. But the affinities are nevertheless striking. In their radically denuded interiors, all traces of modernity seem to have been rejected. Was this a sign of anti-modernism, or was it in fact a sign of modernity itself? Such austerity could be taken as a pointed rejection of the clutter of Victorian taste. In this sense, it echoed the advanced aesthetic sensibility of various vanguards, not impressionist, on either side of the Channel. The artists of the arts and crafts movement on the British side, and their Art Nouveau and secessionist cousins on the continent. So if you were to put these pictures into a company with Klimt and Schiele and Karl Moll in Vienna at the secessionist exhibitions in 1907, they would sit there perfectly well as thoroughly avant-garde pictures. So the affinities are absolutely striking. And if you go hunting, you can find other artists are working in this mode, and they are also looking back to Vermeer. So as I've been arguing, the paintings of the recently rediscovered 17th century Dutch artist Johannes Vermeer enabled artists, not just Hammershøi and Rothenstein, but others as well, to pare down their compositions, arrive at a muted arrangement of monochrome planes and empty volumes, and an atmosphere at the same time of profound emotional restraint. What exactly was it that Dutch painters of the Golden Age, and of Delft in particular, because Delft is the town of De Hoek and Vermeer, could offer 20th century ambitious artists like Rothenstein, Hammershøi, and even Klimt, Moll, and Schiele? So this is a moment which I change slightly and consider the distinctive features of Dutch and Flemish 17th century painting. Because I did promise in the outline of today's talk that I would also go on to discuss a few things in our own collection. So what did Dutch and Flemish painting offer that was distinctive at the time? Well, you can really break it down into four or so categories. I would put them into light, the treatment of light and chiaroscuro, light and shade; surface, gleam, it's called glans by some Dutch theorists; the use of oil paint, a northern invention associated with Van Eyck, which allows you to create chiaroscuro. And then there's structure. And structure is something which I'll touch on briefly at the end, and that's something that's very much aided by the use of modern tools and lenses like camera obscuras. So to start with light. The theoretical history of the depiction of light in painting has long been split along geographical lines between Italy and the Low Countries, Flanders and the Dutch Republic. With Italy's artists developing an approach to light that grew directly out of their understanding of perspective, whereas northern artists are thought to have approached light through observing reflected light on surfaces. So one person who elaborates on this theory is the great art historian Ernst Gombrich, who identifies Veneziano as a good example of this use of an almost unreal bright light that falls evenly around these figures in a shallow perspectival space by Veneziano, painted with tempera, a pigment that does not really allow light to come through its medium because it's just egg white and as egg yolk and pigment mixed together, very opaque, and it dries flat. Gombrich defined this alternative aspect of optical theory that the Dutch offered, calling it a reaction of light to various surfaces first explored by the painters north of the Alps. Gombrich argued that whereas Italian painters of the 15th century used perspective to create the illusion of space and light, which is very theatrical but really quite unreal at the end of the day, Netherlandish artists in the same period sought to produce a sense of realism through the observation and depiction of reflected light from different textured surfaces. And he memorably noted that during the first decades of the 15th century, the two schools of painting, Italian and Dutch, appeared thus to have, quote, divided the kingdom of appearances between them. Gombrich gives an example of Van Eyck's Virgin and Child of 1436 as his pin-up poster of this theory, but you could almost just as easily use a 17th century still life in our collection by an artist known only as Bourguignon of fruit and precious vessels on a tablecloth. cloth on a table. So it is the clever reproduction of light, and particularly reflected light, that brings to life the dewy fruit in this picture, the wet shucked oysters and the lustrous porcelain and pewter vessels, the golden liquids and the gleaming fabrics that you see here. Together, they are known as a pronkstilleven. The Dutch word pronk means ostentatious or sumptuous. So it's an ornate, sumptuous still life. And it's a subject that developed in Antwerp and became popular in the Dutch Republic in the 1640s. And many artists specialised in just this particular type of still life painting. Theatrical front lighting picks out these details for our attention, including the name of the artist across the table's edge. It's just sitting in here. And at the same time, it plunges all else into velvety darkness. While each item might be significant for its allegorical or moral subtext, it is light in the first instance that dictates the direction of our gaze. It is the use of light that has made northern art what art historian Svetlana Alpers has famously called a, quote, art of description, unquote, rather than an Italian art of narrative. It is the capacity of light to accentuate the sensual character of coloured and textured surfaces that has made Netherlandish art so enduringly popular, not only across the affluent and egalitarian society of the Dutch Republic, at a time when the country was flooded with exotic imported fruits and animals and porcelains, etc., objects of curiosity. But it also became enduringly popular in Britain, France, and beyond. Now, Gombrich's division of Dutch and Italian painting and the use of light is not his own invention. It had been well known for centuries beforehand, and it had been particularly developed in a theory of 1604 by a Flemish painter and theorist called Karel van Mander in his famous treatise called the Het Schilderboek, the book on painting, as it's sometimes translated. In chapter 7, Van Mander drew attention to the use of light, and he identified, theorised, and codified many of its different properties and effects. He used words like reflexie and reflexiekunst, so reflection and the art of reflection, and he made those concepts absolutely foundational to the shaping and consciousness of Netherlandish art. The art of reflection means the kinds and degrees of refracted light whose action ranges from sheen, quality of sheen, to mirroring. The Het Schilderboek soon became one of the main sources of art history and art theory in the 15th and 16th century. A bestseller from its first days, it was read by collectors and artists such as Rembrandt and no doubt Vermeer himself. Just as the Eskimos are reputed to have 50 words for snow, northern artists demonstrated a conceptual grasp of light and found ways to develop, explore and articulate its properties that were well in advance of any other culture at the time. Van Mander was the first to articulate the many kinds of light that animate an otherwise static image, calling his theory or system an art of reflection and elaborating on its many properties. Part of this was the proper handling of paint and light, and that involved a use of oil paint, which in its very essence is colour and pigment in tiny particles suspended in a clear oil. Another aspect was net or neat, fine paint brushwork, which is why Dutch artists are called fijnschilders or fine artists. He talks about a quality of glance, which is sheen or lustre, that was intrinsic to all reflective surfaces. Now, you might remember from the exhibition upstairs that in the 19th century, Goethe has painted these beautiful little drawings of spheres, trying to capture the action of reflection, the transparency of liquid, the gleam of the glass surface, etc. So these are things that just captivate many artists over time, but the Dutch were doing it very early on. Van Mander instructed all of his readers, who he assumed to be painters or collectors, that the painter must attend to gold and silver vessels, to clear transparent crystal, and to glasses full of wine, which stain white linen cloths with their reflection. He talks about re-reflection, which is the reflected light of all illuminated things, and secondary reflection, which falls in the dark pools of shadow. Other types of reflection he describes are mirroring or spiegeling, which reflect the image in reverse or upside down in water, glass and metal, on polished stones and other similarly smooth and convex surfaces. So these are the sorts of effects that Goethe himself is Goethe and Turner later on try and capture in their theories and in their drawings. The painting of light in northern art is also, of course, very closely connected to the development of oil painting and its adoption. So in this respect, it had a great advantage over the chalky effects of tempera in Italy, but it also allowed this creation of dark light contrasts, or chiaroscuro as it's known. It also allowed artists to explore different depths of darkness and the elimination of light from their canvases. So in Holland, a whole range of picture forms emerged that featured either natural daylight, moonlight, candlelight, or almost pitch darkness. Van Mander, in particular, was interested in the effects of sunlight and clouds and nighttime phenomena such as forges, volcanoes, lightning, moonlight and firelight. And a particular master of this latter genre, firelight, was Gilles Coignet, a Renaissance Flemish painter from the north, who demonstrated his ability to paint convincing night scenes of an illusionistic quality never before seen. Van Mander refers specifically to a famous panel of Judith showing the head of Holofernes to her people in the dark in an encampment outside a city wall. And he holds it up as an example of the artist's skill and his inventiveness because Coignet had used actual gold leaf to highlight torches and candles. And he also created a blend of glass paste to make the candle lights, the candle flames, seem extra shimmering. And so many critics pointed out that these little blobs of glass paste sat on the surface of the paint of the panel, the wooden panel. Now it's an extraordinary thing, but we now have this picture because it's been given to us in a group of Flemish and Northern Old Master paintings by a new benefactor called Cecile Quayhoft in Antwerp, a former art dealer and connoisseur. So this famous picture, famous in its day, is now here, coming to this gallery in the next couple of months. We'll be very interested to put it under the microscope and see how those blobs of paint have behaved over the centuries. The vogue for Dutch nocturnal scenes of many kinds came to be known as little night scenes, or nachtjes, long outlived the 16th and 17th centuries, in which it had first emerged, and it proved remarkably popular well into the early 20th century in both the Low Countries and in England. The market for night pictures spawned popular artists such as Petrus Schendel, whose picture we have here in the collection, who was nicknamed the Monsieur Chandelle, or Mr. Candles, for his pictures that depicted the night herring and vegetable markets upon which many Dutch and Belgian towns based their prosperity. So this is one that McKelvey had in his own collection, but the National Gallery of Victoria has a couple. Every collection of a certain sort of a period, late 19th century kind, will have an example of Schendel's paintings, simply because they transmitted the ethos of Dutch painting so very well. The legacy of night painting in England is not, to my knowledge, particularly explored by Rothenstein, and nor is it explored by Hammershøi, but it can be found in the work of their contemporaries, in particular Rothenstein's friends and colleagues such as George Clausen. This picture's in our collection. Or the Yorkshire painter John Atkinson Grimshaw, who are both enthusiasts for Dutch aesthetics and who endow brick and stone buildings with a Dutch quietness and mysterious atmosphere, rendering familiar London streetscapes strangely foreign and archaic. Finally, we come to the question of perspective and the camera obscura. So this extraordinary device, which exists in many forms and was developed in Italy and the North, can be considered to be an early precursor to the modern camera. And there's many forms, and some of them are portable, some are whole rooms. Caravaggio used them. But in short, a perspective box consists of a dark chamber with a small hole on one side and a white wall or surface facing it. Light will enter the hole and project the image upside down and in reverse, and then the clever installation of mirrors will correct those orientations. You might remember Kusama's mirrored box upstairs. You could really see that almost as a modern day interpretation of one of these perspective or lens boxes. Now, these sorts of boxes could allow you to do many things. They could allow you to abstract masses of light and dark, so you can get your tones interestingly analysed. It highlighted perspectival lines and plunging perspectives with an almost photographic sort of accuracy. And it could also allow you to see light and its action on surfaces in a way that the human eye is not very good at seeing on its own. So this is like almost the abstract blurring of light on close surfaces. So one of the great masters of this was the artist Karel Fabricius, who many people regard as Vermeer's mentor, who used the perspective box all the time and was considered to be an absolute genius of trompe-l'oeil or illusionistic painting. However, Vermeer was not known to use such a box or such a tool, but he knew very well not only Karel Fabricius's work, but he knew the chief opticians of the time, the people who worked with lenses, and he even paints them in his picture of the astronomer. So he knew all the theories. He had access to this, to an optical box if he'd wished to use it. And many people have long speculated that he did, because if you use a camera obscura or a perspective box and line up the street scenes that I showed you earlier at the very beginning of the talk by Vermeer, the accuracy can be shown to have really been created through using a mechanical device, not just the eye alone. But there was very little explicit evidence that Vermeer did use such a device. But on the other hand, like upstairs in the collection in the Tate show, we see time and again artists are concealing the tricks of their trade. Holland was a very competitive field, and somebody like Vermeer might well have used a box but just not have said anything about it. So this is still open to conjecture, although somebody tells me that at the current exhibition in Amsterdam, art historians are finally deciding to get off the fence and to say that he must have used this sort of tool. And this is just a little example of the wonderful way in which it allows you to see light in a modern and abstract way that only generally a camera would capture. And this is the highlights of the on this woman's robe and on her lips and face that, seen up close, are so extraordinarily abstract that people will tell you that those are the sorts of pools of light that the camera obscura will allow you to identify and accurately reproduce. Now, it's fascinating to me that Dutch 17th century painting enjoyed a renaissance of popularity at the same time that the camera was being invented and developed and applied to painting processes. We know that Hammershøi used a camera to photograph his subjects. I don't know about Rothenstein, but that's quite possible he experimented with it. And just to bring the story back to full circle, it's interesting to know this wonderful Carol Fabricius painting of a goldfinch was in fact owned by Théophile Torre-Berger, the critic who first made Vermeer a household name, and it too was sold at that extraordinary sale in 1892. Little journey, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm very happy to take questions in the last 5 minutes that we have.